I think they are going by the seconds.
Welcome to all participating in the colloquium. Our college, the St. Aloysius College, Autonomous Mangaluru, has organized the colloquium National Education Policy 2020 for the benefit of all stakeholders. Before we begin, Dr. Divya Shetty, Assistant Professor from Department of Chemistry, postgraduate, will render Vaishnavo Janata.
वैष्णव जन तो तेने कही जे पीड़ पराई जाने रे पर दुखी उपकार करे तो ये मन अभिमान नाणे रे वैष्णव जन तो तेने कही जे पीड़ पराई जाने रे सकल लोक मां सहुनी वंदे निंदा न करे केनी रे वाचका शमन निष्कल राखे धन धन जननी तेनी रे वैष्णव जन तो तेने कही जे पीड़ पराई जाने रे समदृष्टि ने तृष्णा त्यागी पर स्त्री जेने मात रे जे हुआ थकी असत्य ना बोले पर धन नव झाले हाथ रे वैष्णव जन तो तेने कही जे पीड़ पराई जाने रे
Thank you. Thank you. The principal of our college, the St. Aloysius Autonomous College, Reverend Dr. Praveen Martis S.J. will now give his message.
Respected eminent resource persons of the day, my dear members of the faculty, and my dear participants, good afternoon and a warm welcome to the colloquium on National Education Policy 2020, organized by St. Aloysius College, Autonomous Mangaluru. We are very happy to have the eminent panelists today, and they are Professor Valerian Rodriguez. He will be speaking on NEP 2020, a critical overview, and Professor Sham Menon on NEP questioning the seriousness of the purpose. Geeta B. Nambisan on NEP right to education of children from the marginal groups in relation to social justice. Reverend Dr. Fraser Mascarenhas, NEP and the concerns of minorities, and Professor A.R. Vasavi on impact of NEP on the rural children and communities. After the cabinet has approved the National Education Policy on July 29th, there have been a lot of debates and webinars and colloquiums, and we are happy to organize this colloquium with another perspective. Yesterday, we had organized one webinar at St. Aloysius College from the insider's perspective, those who are involved in drafting the National Education Policy. And today, we have the perspective from the academicians and the administrators who are already involved in education for many years, for decades, and they will give their perspective today so that we can understand the National Education Policy from a total point of view, so we can understand totally and try to implement. Of course, there are a lot of debates on the time of the national education policy, whether it's the right time to approve this national education policy when we are all struggling, when there's so much of a crisis around and a pandemic which has struck all of us. There are different things that are happening in the country. That is one perspective, one question that I think all of us ask at this moment, and whether we will be able to implement it, this national education policy according to the government schedule. These are various things that I think we will be able to debate today and able to understand from various perspectives. Once again, I'm really happy that our college has organized this colloquium under the leadership of Dr. Rosevira and team. I would like to congratulate them and thank all the panelists today for accepting our invitation to enlighten us. Thank you. God bless us.
Thank you, Father. Dr. Rosevira de Souza, Dean of Arts Faculty and HOD of Political Science Department, will now shortly introduce the panelists to us.
Father Principal, our esteemed panelists, and the participants of this colloquium, I'm happy to introduce the august panelists of today's panel. I would introduce them according to the sequence of their presentation. We have amidst us Professor Valerian Rodriguez, a renowned political scientist, addressing us on the theme NEP 2020, a critical overview. He's a former professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and was a national fellow of Indian Council of Social Science Research, ICSSR, and later Ambedkar Chair, Ambedkar University, Delhi, quite recently. He has written extensively on Dr. Ambedkar and contemporary political issues. The second panelist, Professor Shyam Menon, is a professor at the Central Institute of Education, University of Delhi since 1994. He was the founding Vice Chancellor of the Ambedkar University, Delhi during 2008-2018 and has done a commendable service at the very inception of this public university dedicated to social sciences and humanities. His work has mainly been in curriculum studies, higher education, and teacher education. Professor would address us on NEP, questioning the seriousness of purpose. Third in the row today, we have Professor Geeta B. Nambisan, former professor of sociology of education at the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Madam has published widely in the areas of exclusion, inclusion, and equity in education, with particular reference to the schooling of marginalized sections of Indian society, Dalits, Adivasis, and the urban poor. Professor will address us on the theme, right to education of children from the marginal groups in relation to social justice and the present education policy proposed. The next speaker in the panel is Dr. Fraser Mascarenhas S.J., the former principal of St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. Father Mascarenhas has served on the working group for undergraduate education of the National Knowledge Commission in 2006. Father is specialized in development studies, and in 2011, he has served on the steering committee of the Planning Commission for Higher and Technical Education in the 12th Plan. His work on non-formal education is commendable. Father would speak to us on NEP and the concerns of minorities. The fifth panelist, Professor A.R. Vasavi has done a tremendous service to the rural children. Based in Karnataka, her areas of interest are alternative education, rural and agrarian studies, sociology of education, sociology of India, and contemporary social theory. She is currently a member of the Punachit collective that works on alternative learning. She would be addressing us on impact of NEP on the rural children and communities. May I request all the panelists to take 18 minutes and create ample opportunities for the participants to interact, which would be followed after all the panelists present. I request the participants to write their questions in the chat box, and the team here at St. Aloysius will monitor to put them to the panelists. Thank you.
Professor Valerian Rodriguez will be the first speaker.
Esteemed fellow panelists, Father Dr. Praveen Martis, the principal of St. Aloysius College, Dr. Rosevira D'Souza, professors and faculty of St. Aloysius College, students, and my friends. It's a great privilege to be part of this company of the panelists. Most of them are people whom I have read and have admired over the years. All of them have been great educationists. NEP, National Education Policy 2020, is a policy document that in many ways surprises you. It is removed from the humdrum of the political conflicts that our public life is invariably caught in. It does not display the overt ideological stamp of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh or Hindutva that we mostly expected. And in many ways is shrouded with that childlike innocence that we all being adults today tend to miss out. It's a long document, and the complex relations and connections that it builds up across the various stages of the educational curriculum makes you proceed haltingly through it unless you want to be drowned in its innocence, sometimes verbosity, and optimism. For those of you who are not introduced to the document, let me sum it up in my own way because it will help me to make its appraisal later. The document lends itself to be divided into 4 compartments. 1, the goals and principles of educational curriculum. 2, the charter for school education. 3, recommendations for higher education. And 4, the support regime it envisages for its implementation. The first, goals and principles. The goals it sets for education, and I'm quoting from the document, is economic growth, social justice and equality, scientific advancement, national integration, and cultural preservation. It further specifies them. calling economic growth as sustainable development. Scientific advancements is being nurturing a pedagogy which is experiential, holistic, integrated, inquiry-ridden, discovery-oriented, learner-centered, discussion-based, and enjoyable. It talks about ancient and eternal Indian thought and knowledge and wants to turn India once again into what it calls Vishwa Guru, as it believes it was once upon a time. The principle it invokes for education is to develop good human beings capable of rational thought and action, possessing compassion and empathy, courage and resilience, scientific temper and creative imagination with sound ethical moorings. The products of education, it argues, should be engaged, productive, and contributing citizens. While these goals and principles are stated in the beginning of the document, some of them are recalled and new ones are added through the document, such as ethical and moral reasoning, knowledge and practice of human values, gender sensitivity, etc. Let me come to the Charter of School Education. New education policy has an excellent critique of the existing school education. It says that it is rote learning, fragmentary, inequity is rampant in it, and non-inclusiveness is its built-in quality. There are high rate of dropouts. Its irrelevance to life skills and occasional choices is known to everyone. There is a poor quality of many teachers, and its mode of governance is as fragmented as the school education. It recommends replacement of the existing 10+2 pattern of school education into a 4-stage pattern, 5+3+3+4, covering the age group 3 to 18 years. For each one of these stages, it makes strong curricular recommendations and proposes overall system of resource-based and governance. It suggests that early childhood care and learning must be flexible, multifaceted, multi-level, play-based, activity-prone, inquiry-oriented learning. It should involve learning alphabets, languages, numbers, counting, colors, shapes, indoor-outdoor play, puzzles, logical thinking, problem solving, drawing, painting, visual art, craft, drama, and puppetry, music, and movement. It should also cultivate, according to it, social capacities such as sensitivity, good behavior, courtesy, ethical values, personal and public cleanliness, teamwork, and cooperation. It stresses on removing biases with regard to culture, religion, language, gender identities, etc. It proposes that all curriculum and pedagogy be strongly rooted in the Indian and local context. At the secondary level, there will be no hard separation among curricular and extracurricular or co-curricular activity, or between arts, humanities, and sciences, and between vocational and academic streams.
Babu, has it started? अच्छा, my Nokia is going.
It feels
ये
that
Nokia
the
बंद कर
rhythm
दी
of
बेटू.
instruction
ये Nokia बंद कर दी.
until at least grade 5, but preferably till grade 8 and beyond, will be the home language, stroke, mother tongue, stroke, local language, and regional language. It argues that school education should nurture competence in language, scientific temper, evidence-based thinking, creativity, and innovativeness, and a sense of aesthetics and art, capacity for oral and written communication, understanding of health and nutrition, physical education, fitness, wellness, and sports, collaboration with teamwork, problem solving, and reasoning. Coming to third, higher education. The policy correctly identifies the major problems of higher education. Its fragmentation, ignoring cognitive skills and learning outcomes, rigid separation of disciplines, limited access, limited autonomy, poor career management and progression of faculty, poor quality of resources and research funding, weak governance and leadership, ineffective regulatory system, large affiliating universities, etc. It seeks to develop well-formed individuals that possess critical 21st century capacities across diverse fields like arts, humanities, languages, sciences, social sciences, professional and technical and vocational fields. It also stresses on soft skills such as communication, discussion, and debate. It seeks to complete what, according to its own term, complete overall and re-energizing of the higher education system. It calls for large multidisciplinary universities, colleges, and higher education clusters with a student strength of 3,000 or more, at least one in each district, modeled around the iconic Takshashila and Nalanda universities. There would be three types of universities: those which emphasize on teaching and research, those which emphasize on teaching, and those which emphasize on teaching and research as well. It argues that autonomous degree granting colleges, which eventually would become either universities or become constituent units of universities. It argues for the abolition of all multiple nomenclatures such as deemed to be university, affiliating university, university, unitary university, etc., and begin to argue for a distinct and widely accepted concept of university as universal, intersecting, and multidisciplinary education. It calls for an integrated higher education system, including professional and vocational education. UG education would integrate humanities, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There would be credit-based courses in community engagement and service. Professional and technical education will become integral part of the overall education. There will be multiple entry and exit points, and the bachelor degree would be 3 or 4 years, and there would be an academic bank of credits which will maintain the accounts, credit accounts of a person if he or she wants to reconnect to higher education again or wants to shift from one locale to another locale. Let me come to the regulatory regime. The National Educational Curriculum sets up the Higher Education Council and divides its responsibility into 4 branches, which are going to deal with accreditation, funding, and academic and standard setting, respectively. With regard to the regulatory regime of the school system, It invests a great deal of initiative on the NCRT and sets up the National Assessment Center, PARAK. It introduces for school education a 4-year B.Ed degree for teachers, and it is the National Assessment Center which would eventually approve whether a teacher is qualified or not. Let me come to my last portion, my own assessment. There are many positives in this document. There is a relative coherence across this document, and it handles a breathtaking scope. One of the oft-repeated phrases across this document is, to quote, inclusion, access, and quality. On some of these concerns, the document goes into length, as in the case of reaching out to disability, to the Devyangs, and socially and educationally disadvantaged groups. It takes into account not merely disadvantages, but how, in the case of many, several disadvantages intersect and overlap. The diagnosis of what ails our educational curriculum is excellent, and the proposal that it mounts as correctives cannot be faulted. I personally appreciate its emphasis on mother tongue, the 3-language formula, and Sanskrit learning. The restoration of the idea of university as a multidisciplinary learning and research complex is something to be welcomed. So is the stress on enhancements of quality of education and its emphasis on reflective, imaginative educational curriculum against rote learning. Its assault on disciplinary ghettos and combining several disciplines will be greatly welcome. But there are many negatives, and I will just take about 2 minutes to highlight them. Many of the terms employed, goals and principles, are woolly, contested, and have been the philosopher's nightmare. Actually, the document should have foregrounded the preamble of India as the leading principle stance, and throughout the document, there is very little emphasis on the constitutional vision of India. My second big problem is, where is the social capital for carrying out this great design? Any kind of this design, which is an Archimedean kind of a design, which wants to transplant India into another educational zone, requires a major consensus, a pre-political consensus. And that is something which it is not concerned about. Eventually, it would be a state-run project, little eliciting societal concerns or societal consensus. It effectively turns the states of India into executive agencies of the central government. It talks about a diversity, but the diversity it talks about is a narrow diversity. It does not talk about a diversity that is central to India, where people believe in distinct conceptions and ways of life. It has no place for it. Its approach towards the minorities is largely patriarchal.
Professor,
Let me conclude with this last 2 sentences. In many ways, it is an attempt to wipe the slate clean and rewrite on it afresh. Is it possible? Not very likely. It would be a politics of fantasy. And if Some parts of this document are going to be realized, then it is going to be parallel to the existing architecture, and some people are likely to get benefited out of this parallel structure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We move to the next panelist, Professor Shyam Menon.
Thank you very much. Respected fellow panelists, our hosts, the St. Aloysius College community, to whom we owe a special thanks, and esteemed colleagues. Professor Valerian's presentation has made my task much easier in the sense he has anticipated some of the arguments which I am trying to present here. So in that sense, it has already laid a foundation for me to build an edifice. My presentation is in parts. In the first part, I argued the vision that the policy paints colorful, yet it is essentially an attempt to build new structures, recycling the debris of an old bureaucratic culture. In the second part, I will take up mention of what I consider the political function that the policy serves, namely that of undermining federalism and making incursions into the domain of the states, which Professor Valerian has already alluded to. Let me come to my first part. It appears to me that the utility of a national policy in education is primarily as a political document addressing particularly the core constituency that the dominant political formation draws support from. There are, of course, conflicting interests within this core constituency itself. I see two distinct segments that see a common cause with each other and at the same time have conflicts of interest. But both these segments form the core constituency of the present political dispensation. The first segment comprises two intertwining strands: the market forces and an upwardly mobile and fiercely aspirational middle class whose fortunes are critically aligned with those of the market forces. And the second segment is those demographics which are ideologically oriented towards cultural nationalism. It becomes imperative for a policy not to explicitly go against the ideological segment while painting the big picture. So every policy has got a big picture and also the operational part. So in the big picture, you ensure that there is enough rhetoric to appease or to not to antagonize the core ideological segment. At the same time, the specific provisions of the policy, although couched in rhetoric, will need to give scope for multiple interpretations, ensuring that in practice, these will not go against the interests of the middle class and the market. Therefore, ambiguity and vagueness are a virtue in policy formulation. See, a good example is that of English medium. I mean, it says a lot of stuff about local and vernacular, local and Indian languages, but it actually leaves a lot of doors open for English to sneak in. So because it doesn't want to antagonize the middle class. It is difficult to pinpoint, therefore, specific proposals in the National Education Policy 2020 for any kind of scrutiny precisely because of its vagueness and ambiguity. Besides, it's a bit tricky to enter the document and attempt to assess the efficacy or desirability of one proposal or the other, because in doing so, we will have accepted the basic assumptions of the policy. My sense is that it is precisely the assumptions of the policy as well as the context, manner, and timing of its promulgation that is ridden with problems. The policy is plainly and simply a list of intentions by the union government. Most of these are fairly well articulated, many of them arguably well-intentioned. After all, the document is the culmination of about 2 years of collective reflection of a group of wise people. But much of it is full of truisms and freestyle visions, which does not have the responsibility of couching in any kind of concrete trajectory or a roadmap. These are often difficult to contest, therefore, precisely because they are visions. Who can contest, for instance, when the policy says that in 15 years it intends to double the intake of students in higher education, or that there will be assurance of autonomy of teachers and institutions and quality of transactions, or that the regulatory architecture will discharge a facilitative role through a quote unquote light but tight approach, whatever that means. And as they say in native language, Kathayil Chodyamilla. You can't ask rational questions when a story is being told. My contention is that while document is too elusive for an internal scrutiny, it's still possible to probe into the seriousness of purpose of the policy by asking the following questions. How does the policy propose to realize its vision? What is the roadmap? 2, most of what is proposed may need much greater public investments in education. What is the strategy to mobilize additional resources to make this possible? Apart from reiterating the pious intention that the earlier policies have already stated, that there shall be an endeavor to increase public spending in education to 6% of the GDP, there is pretty much nothing that is being mentioned in this document to demonstrate a concrete commitment on the part of the government to honor this. 3, the history of education policies and their implementation has taught us that the government space offers a strong and pervasive inertial force, makes it important to bring about a transformation in the systemic and institutional cultures of mistrust and control. So wouldn't this subvert many of the arguably well-intentioned proposals of the policy? To these questions, the standard responses from the establishment and its apologists have been the following. First, NEP 2020 is only a framework. Wait till the strategy and the program of action are fully articulated. Don't judge it as yet. Second, it is not correct to say that everything needs assured funding. There are plenty of low-hanging fruits among possible initiatives that will need no additional investment. So the strategy will be to start with these and gradually to find ways of mobilizing extra resources. Third, the skepticism of lingering cultural legacies that would subvert new institutions, the answer often is the political context of NEP 2020 is different from those of the earlier policies. Decisive dispensation now. So don't extrapolate and arrive at premature conclusions based on your past experience. Well, what I conclude from all these is that it appears that the policy document is only a skeletal form. It's flesh and blood in terms of strategy and resources. It's flesh and blood in terms of its strategy and yet to be articulated, which begs the question why it was promulgated in a hurry in the first place. As is really different, and is it really different as is made out to be? The more closely I read NEP 2020, the more I'm convinced that what makes this document different is essentially its claim that it is different. It's almost like Maggie hot and sour or something like that. It's different. The emphasis on highlighting its difference from the earlier policies, starting with its very name. Other policies are called National Policy on Education. This policy is called National Education Policy. So the emphasis on highlighting its difference is part of a larger political project of denying history and pretending that everything is being thought through anew on a blank slate. Professor Valerian mentioned this correctly in his presentation. It is part of a political messaging that this is a new India which is being built not on the foundations of foundations that is already laid, but by dismantling them and replacing them with brand new ones. The problem is that education is a continuing enterprise. There are systems, institutions, processes, conventions, and cultures that are already in place and functional, and which have their own roots and histories. Moreover, there are real people who populate not merely the education institutions, but the very ecosystem of the government, with mindsets shaped by long years of enculturation, reinforced by a self-serving and self-perpetuating power structure. You can't wish them away. They are not going anywhere. Neither they nor the cultures they live and reproduce. In other words, much of the mediocrity in the system stems out of a culture of mistrust and control, the seeds of which are in the very DNA of our larger system, not confined to higher education. So it is disappointing that the policy employs structures and mechanisms that are built out of the same genetic material to engineer the structural transformation of the entire ecosystem of higher education as it claims. For instance, when the policy envisages a set of national level regulatory institutions in higher education, about which Professor Valerian mentioned, it is willy-nilly giving in to centralization and imposition of a uniform template. In fact, the NEP 2020 itself is an exercise of imposing uniformity and standardization along a single axis of control and power, which is paradoxical given India's size, population, diversity, and constitutional federalism. India has doubled the population of that of Europe, the entire Europe. And India is more than the population of the entire continent of Africa. The light but tight approach in the regulatory processes is perhaps well-intentioned, but from past experiences, we know that these are mostly subverted by the deeply entrenched bureaucratic culture that will pervade any new institution created within the larger governmental ecosystem. When you build new institutions, recycling the debris of an old institutions, the genetic material out of which these are created remains the same. And so there will be an unbroken continuity in the institutional culture. This brings me to the second part, which is basically on the how this policy engages with the federal character of the Constitution. This is just an example. It actually, every initiative of this government, in some sense, engages with one or the other aspect of the Constitution, with which I think they have a lot of problem. It looks Indian Constitution is their major, adversary. Although education is in the concurrent list, much of its operations are within the domain of states. And as much as 75 to 80% of the total public spending in education is by states. It is therefore unthinkable that a national policy on education can be truly national unless the states also have a sense of ownership for it and willingly align themselves with it. Otherwise, it becomes merely a policy of the union government. But for that, there is a need for consensus building. There were possibilities of this through institutions like the Central Advisory Board of Education, which was meant for this purpose, and of course the Parliament. But such a route was, however, abandoned. NEP 2020 was never taken through the Parliament. This was a clear deviation from the manner in which the earlier policies were promulgated. It is only in meaningful partnership with the state governments that the union government can translate a national policy on education into reality. At the time when NPE 1968 was promulgated, education was still in the state list. All the same, the policy acknowledged the importance of such a partnership by stating explicitly that the union government would, and I quote, in addition to undertaking programs in the central sector, would assist the state governments for the development of programs of national importance, where coordinated action on the parts of states and center was called for. The NPE 1986, however, came after a decade after the 42nd Amendment of the Constitution that moved education from the state list to the concurrent. The policy was alive to the new roles vested in the center consequential to the amendment, yet it clarified that, and I quote, concurrency signifies a partnership, which is at once meaningful and challenging. The national policy will be oriented towards giving effect to it in letter and spirit, unquote. NEP 2020, on the other hand, invokes the state only in the context of increase in investment in education. And I quote, this policy unequivocally endorses and envisions a substantial increase in public investment in education by both the central government and all state governments. The center and the states will work together to increase the public investment in education sector to reach 6% of the GDP at the earliest, unquote. There is a significant difference in tone between the three policies on the matter of the states. NPE 1968 talked of its intention to quote unquote assist the states, while NPE 1986 highlighted quote unquote a partnership with them. NEP 2020, on the other hand, talks about neither of these. Instead, it takes the state's concurrence for granted when making a major financial commitment on their behalf. The fall in the fortunes of the state between 1968 and 2020 could not have been more evident. Whether it is stated or not, ensuring ownership by the states is an imperative for the formulation of any national policy, particularly one on a sector that is in the concurrent list. However, that would mean extensive consultations and consensus building, which are often somewhat tedious exercises, low on optics. Core constituencies of the ruling political formation might have perceived that it does not behove a strong government to pursue such a conciliatory and low-profile approach. They may prefer an approach that appears to exude strength, determination, and decisiveness. This instills in a government the penchant for converting every situation into an opportunity for curating a spectacle. It thus becomes desirable for a union government to work towards being perceived strong and decisive, even if it means that it might compromise the efficacy of the implementation of its policy. The manner in which the promulgation of NEP 2020 was made and its timing chosen just preceding the Independence Day makes complete sense in this context. My sense is that NEP 2020 becomes yet another instrument to push the envelope so far as the union government's attempt at exerting its authority over the states is concerned. Federalism is one of the tenets of the Constitution that a strong government at the center is often somewhat uneasy about and somewhat irritated with. Mrs. Gandhi's government in 1970s was similar. Therefore, there is a tendency to make incursions into the state's domain through acts of parliament and cabinet decisions, even in those sectors that are in the state list. Whether it is the, yes.
You have 3 minutes left.
Okay, I will finish it.
Thank you.
Whether it is the Motor Vehicles Act of September 2019 or the manner in which the national lockdown as part of the COVID-19 pandemic management was announced in March 2020, the union government seems to be making it a point not to waste any opportunity to make legislative and executive incursions into the state's domain, often in the name of national interest. The NEP 2020 becomes another such instance. To conclude, NEP 2020 becomes another opportunity not for uncritical compliance of a fiat, but for reflection and thoughtful response and action on the part of communities of students, academics, and citizens. Our past experience shows that in a couple of years, the policy per se may recede to the background, and our lives may get taken over by the subterranean forces, both market, aspirations of the dominant classes, as well as the economic we may witness the medium and long term. Let us see not just a flare of our collective deliberation. I hope it's a continuous deepening reflective process. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We
Allow
now
me to start.
Professor Geeta Nambisan, Madam.
Yeah. I want to thank the principal and the teachers and the St. Aloysius community for organizing this webinar. I think the previous speakers have really mapped out what exactly the policy is and some of the very key concerns. And I'd just like to maybe bring in a different point. I agree with a lot of what they're saying. I would like to highlight to start that the sociologists have urged us to view policymaking as a process. They emphasize the importance of the social context in which education policy emerges, the contestations between diverse and contradictory interests and aspirations that shape discourses around policy and processes of decision making. And that is where then you finally see a text before you, such as the NEP. And as Professor Menon says, there's much more to this we have to see. So it's a kind of a process. Thus, for instance, in the late 1960s, 10 years after India's independence, the major concern of education, as outlined in the first NEP, 1968, was with national development, social integration, the idea of common schools, special attention to clearly named SC/ST, educationally disadvantaged groups within the frame of equality of opportunity. Private schools were minimal then, but they were seen to lead to greater stratification and segregation. And it was the state that had the responsibility to ensure the promise of education, especially for children in the 0 to 14-year age group. This was unquestioned at that point of time. By the mid-1980s, global changes, the need for excellence and competitiveness, concerned with India's image in, say, the Human Development Index, were all reflected in policy. Larger social movements, and especially the women's movement, saw significant inclusion of an exclusive chapter on education for women's equality. The third national education policy in 2020 comes at the end of more then 2 decades of neoliberal globalization, the ideology and practices of markets in every sphere of society, the retreat of the state in the social sector, the state and partnerships with private sector, business and schooling, and the emergence of what is called the global education industry, driven by educational technology, digitization, big data. We're also seeing the growing fragmentation of society, communal conflicts, hypernationalism. On the one hand, the constitutional values being negated, as well as global citizenship on the other. Also important is that whereas the first 2 education policies were framed by the nation state and within the nation state, the last 2 decades have seen the rise of global education policy and key corporate players, international development organizations, and others who are shaping global and national education policy, what is called usually policy mobilities. For instance, the language of choice, vouchers, flexibility is there around the world and even in our own policy. There are powerful networks, transnational, with business interests that are shaping schooling not merely in the private sector, but publicly funded schooling as well. This is a period of growing inequalities, loss of livelihoods, especially of the poor who belong to historically discriminated castes, scheduled caste Dalits, marginalized ethnicities, Adivasis, minorities, and so on. Gender as well as marginal geographies, rural, urban, poor settlements intersect with social and economic inequalities, making increasingly large sections economically and socially vulnerable on the one hand, and yet highly aspirational, where good quality English medium education for their children is concerned. And as they leave the government schools, which have been neglected for many days, and turn to expanding educational markets, unrecognized schools and services for their children. And this has led to the expansion of for-profit markets, including for targeted at the poor. We now hear of social impact investing by corporates, their philanthropic foundations. So you find that today the for-profit markets, even in elementary education, has been normalized, justified in policy and discourses. Discourses have been constructed and circulated around private institutional arrangements that are shown as far more efficient in relation to learner outcomes and meeting global targets as compared to state-funded or public schools. So that is one context. A landmark development at the end of the first decade of the 21st century has been the securing of the right to education, RTE 2009, for all children from 6 to 14 years, while the early years was included in the directive principles of state policy. The RTE lays down norms for schools, curriculum, teachers, etc., and underscores the responsibility of the state, as well as obligations of the private sector within an RTE framework in ensuring children the right to equitable education. And here, equitable is not merely equality of learning outcomes, but it has the element of justice and fairness in it. It is in this increasingly complex context of changing society and education in India and the most marginal groups within it that we need to carefully read the 2020 policy. And I will highlight some concern. The NEP highlights the learning crisis that needs urgent attention and the need for a national mission for this purpose. In the last 2 decades, education has been reduced to learning outcomes which are narrow goals, individualized and bereft of the social and pedagogical relations between pupil and teacher and the broader perspective that we associate with education and the right to education rather than the right to learning. The learner at risk is shown to come from an umbrella category, earlier URG, unrecognized groups, now dropped and replaced by an equally general and vague SEDG, socially and economically disadvantaged groups. The policy fights shy of naming the roots of these disadvantages, which are structural and lead to cultural marginalization and stigmatization, all of which affect children's education in different ways, and hence there are pedagogic and curricular implications. It is hence doing these groups an injustice, and as it sees education as a concern of the individual out of the social and institutional context in which she or he is located. To address this crisis and ensure high quality education, especially for the so-called SEDGs, It recommends multiple pathways, multiple models while maintaining flexibilities and providing choice to the individual learner, and emphasizes the need for loosening the restrictions of the RTE. When you have such a statement, then you have to listen again as to what really is going on. What again is striking on the one hand is the apparent simplicity with which the crisis can be addressed. Focused attention on the learner to bring them up if they fall back, if they drop out, are through programs characterized by voluntariness, citing research that is said to have shown that this yields results. Peer tutoring, students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds tutoring each other. Instead of having really high quality education, teachers equipped to teach them, and address their needs. And what is suggested is drawing on volunteers from the community for remedial instruction. The earlier suggested prestigious National Tutor Program and Remedial Instructions RIAP has been dropped, but it reflects how policy expects to address generations of deprivation and disadvantage as a result of social discrimination, isolation, and we mustn't forget that tutoring is today one of the fastest growing unregulated business. And Pearson does have something called the Tutor Vista. And so if you have a national tutors program or you bring tutors into the policy, you are justifying a business in tutoring. Globally, testing of learning outcomes, competitiveness and rankings, increasing competitiveness between and within countries is part of global education policy. There are big corporate players in the business of there are big corporate players in the business of testing. If you look at PISA and all that, the policy also sees the need for repeated testing to monitor, track, and each learner through the school years, and census testing in class 3, 5, and so on. There are online digital opportunities for adaptive feedback, which will be personalized, and so on. If research is being cited here, there is research to show that there is no pedagogic rationale for repeated testing of children, especially expressly warns against testing and examination in the early school years. And we're talking about the most disadvantaged groups. Research shows that increasing commercialization of comparison that such testing brings does not improve the quality of education in high poverty areas, nor reduce learning gaps. On the other hand, there's a narrowing of curriculum, teaching to test, and malpractices such as keeping children back so that the examination results are much better. I mean, many children are then sent to open learning, and you can which group is sent. Good teachers are seen as critical. Pre-service programs are mentioned, but also that 95% of teacher education institutes are private and of poor quality. However, good quality teacher education equipping teachers to address the pedagogic needs of the most disadvantaged does not appear a concern. We are told that teachers will be recruited to testing. There will be a range of flexible methods. Teachers will be trained to carry out assessments, adaptive formal assessment, tracking, monitoring, how to use tutors, remedial instruction, how to use smartphones and all that to raise learning outcomes. Now, if there are also teacher development and alternate certification and accreditation is a fast growing market. So if you allow for alternate ways of teacher education, it is the market that will come in. Teach for India, for instance, linked to Teach for America, has a totally different kind of volunteer teachers, contract-based, etc. Modules for school readiness in class 1 and a range of other modules and online resource apps. I mean, we are looking really at technology coming in, and I have done some work on low-cost business of schooling, the for-profit chains, the Bridge International Academy, where technology is used for standardization of curriculum, minimal skills packaged as high-quality education, which is transacted by poorly paid school graduates, remotely directed through smartphones. You have the robotic teacher. Now, is this going to happen? This is what we have to be careful. Equity is highlighted, but it is equality of learning outcomes across genders, social categories. Now, I don't want to go into the SEDG because I'm not able to understand what is given gender identities, given social cultural identities, given this. So it is really a very confused kind of conceptualization. Special education zones where there are large populations of so-called SEDGs as focus of intervention shows little understanding of these groups, their social location, vulnerability, what will you do for migrant populations, and as kind of homogenization. Special education zones was flagged a decade ago as part of the advocacy for private schools for the poor to enable the growth of unregulated education business. So the same SEZ is coming back. NEP fails to contextualize the larger crisis in economy and society, the deeply divided society, the present COVID crisis, and what this may mean for a new education policy, and especially groups that have experienced historical disadvantage and discrimination, as well as contemporary marginalities. Nor is the institutional context of education highlighted, a deeply stratified system of publicly funded education, with the poorest and most disadvantaged concentrated in standalone government primary schools of abysmal quality, while better off section among them turn to private low-cost schools that do not offer quality education that these parents aspire to. And these are also unsustainable, as we have seen during the COVID crisis. The private, low-cost private advantage in education is not there. And it is more recently that studies have showed that if you control for social background, there is no private advantage. There is little reference to the changing landscape of schooling, privatization, market reforms, etc. But this is the absent presence that frames the policy. We know that the reforms are embedded in a global and national agenda of privatization. If you look at the language, flexibility, choice, outcomes, managerial ideas, techniques and practices from the corporate sector for the governance of publicly provided education. I think we have to look more closely at the report. And there's also need to draw attention to advocacy and research that has created a common sense of what good education is. And we might find that tutor-led education will be constructed as good education. There'll be discourses around it, and many people will believe that, yes, maybe this is good for marginal groups. Researchers have been highlighting that post-2015, the global education industry include corporate organizations and their philanthropic foundations. And we have this category of philanthropic public partnerships. So who are these people? And think tanks, international organizations, there are platforms for building advocacy and all that today. So the business of education today, including with public service resources and services, there are a range of services that are being today marketed. Today, the language is one of social impact investing, and private finances is investing in education business, especially educational technology. You have a lot of edu startups, which a lot of these corporate philanthropic foundations are funding. And the idea is that here are the private sector, which is doing good for the public, but also they are getting profit. So there's nothing wrong with it. Global platforms on global education policy, including those at the national level, dialogue the good in education, building new imaginaries that the role that educational technology can play in ushering education that is relevant for the present and the future. So you have the whole emphasis on innovative interventions, creative interventions, disrupting the rut of education, adaptive personalized learning, online, digital. Now, we have seen during COVID as to really what has happened with this kind of learning, especially for the poor and marginal groups. There's also, I think, the idea that the private can be the new public. So you find, especially when you talk about public philanthropic, that here is a sector that can do good. And this is what we really have to see. And which are the companies that are there in educational technology? You have the Dell Foundation, MSDF, Pearson Affordable Learning Fund, Gates Foundation, Clinton Foundation, and a whole lot of other foundations who are today coming into education, and so they obviously, even if they have foundations, it is the business interests of the corporate group that really will be important. So we need to look at it.
Professor,
yeah. How
you
many
have
minutes?
1.5 minutes.
Okay, so basically, I think that my point is that one has to look more clearly at policy, even if we are looking at the public-private partnerships. I have a number of examples which I'm not able to give, where you have, whether it is the excellence program in Mumbai, the Teach for India, or many other organizations which are coming into schools. I think we need to look at the kind of ideologies and practices that are coming in. And what we really need to look at is what is the larger purpose of education, the whole going back to constitutional values. How do we strengthen the social fabric? What is the kind of education that is required? What are the implications of the trends that we are seeing for the right to education, which lays down norms and standards, because they have special relevance for poor and disadvantaged groups. So I think the point is that, I think that's the last point I'm making, there's an urgent questions to be raised, even regarding the publicly funded, in terms of teachers, teacher educations, pedagogies, and institutionalized processes that will strengthen, I think, the publicly funded education. The very purpose of education from the perspective of substantial social justice, democratic citizenship, and the broader goals of education, as well as social mobility for the most disadvantaged, is not really reflected. And I just would like to say that we need much more research, new methodologies to understand the complexity of the policy and policy making processes, the social and political context, diverse networks that are in play, and also to see how we will strengthen the public in education from the perspective of a holistic education and the standpoint of the most marginal groups. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a bit rushed.
Thank you, madam. Our next speaker is Reverend Dr. Fraser Mascarenhas. Over to you, mother.
Where's my phone, Betu?
Thank you. It's a real privilege to take part in this colloquium. And I think I'd like to say thank you to St. Aloysius College and all those who have organized this. I found the three presentations that have been given so far really worth my while joining this colloquium, because all three have spoken so well and given me so much of food for thought, especially Professor Shyam Menon. But I think there's been a lot to think about. Let me add a few things from the minority perspective, because I've been running for maybe 40 years now. I've been associated with minority institutions, sometimes as the head. And therefore, it is the concerns of minority institutions are uppermost in my mind, especially when a new education policy comes in. And when I talk about minority, at least from the perspective of Maharashtra, we are talking of both linguistic and religious minorities. So these are the concerns I'd like to express. Let me start by something that prefaced the new education policy itself. The goal number 4 of the SDGs, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, that has been quoted to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all by 2030. And then the document goes on to say, such a lofty goal will require the entire education system to be reconfigured to support and foster learning. Perhaps we should reconsider this, because I think even Professor Valerian talked about, wiping the slate clean. That is the idea of this document. And Professor Menon talked about also denying history and dismantling and rebuilding. Now, is that what the country needs? Yes, the needs are great and very urgent, but do we need this? Because this is very clearly coming through from the document. The speakers have also mentioned that. However, like the other speakers before me, especially Professor Valerian, I think we all acknowledge that the wording, the PR that has been given for the document, the goals, I think they have been expressed in excellent terms. So I'd like to mention some of these terms. Some of those paragraphs are so rich in meaning that I think we need to take those seriously. Let me read a few because I'll give you some examples of what impressed me. For example, with the quickly changing employment landscape and global ecosystem, it is becoming increasingly critical that children not only learn, but more importantly, learn how to learn. Absolutely. That's what is required. Quote again, education must move towards less content and more towards critical thinking, problem solving, creative innovation, etc. Again, the curriculum must include basic arts, crafts, humanities, games, sports, culture, values, in addition, of course, to science and mathematics, to develop the all-round capabilities of the learners and make education more rounded. So well put, really. I must commend the framers, the drafters of this policy. Education must build character. Even that has come in. Obviously, that's something nobody will dispute. And then for all the teachers here, I think you will find that cockles of your heart are warmed by these statements. The teacher must be at the center of the fundamental reforms in the education system. And not only that, the new education policy must help re-establish teachers at all levels as the most respected and essential members of our society. Which teacher will dispute this? So you can see that very lovely language has been used. Education has been also talked about as a great leveler, is the best tool for achieving economic and social mobility, inclusion, equality. So these are the ways, the words in which the whole document has been couched. Very lovely words, well expressed. Then you have fundamental principles that will guide the education system. It seems to summarize all these, talking about recognizing, identifying, and fostering the unique capabilities of each student. Very much needed. Foundational literacy and numeracy, you have to start with that. Multidisciplinarity and holistic education, emphasis on conceptual understanding, creativity and critical thinking, ethics and constitutional values. So my friends, you get the trend of what my argument is. That I think really the criteria given, the goals, the whole vision is really very well expressed. And I think we must acknowledge that. Now I have a question, and that is in response to wiping the slate clean or totally dismantling and rebuilding. Are there institutions today that show these principles and characteristics in some measure, if not in a large measure, in some measure? Are there institutions like that already in our system? And if you think, you will realize that there are a large number of these, and many of them are minority institutions. Maybe you'll think it presumptuous of me to say that because I'm a member of a minority institution. Let me clarify that I'm saying it on behalf of both the linguistic and religious minorities. And at least in Mumbai and Maharashtra, we have large examples. But look at the rating systems. We have private and government rating systems. You will find minority schools and colleges at the forefront in large number, whether it is the NIRF, which is recent, or for colleges, the India Today poll, the Christian and other minority institutions have come up very high in those lists. For schools, Education World and Hindustan Times polls. For example, there's a Christian institution, happens to be a Jesuit institution, like St. Aloysius, which for 7 years in a row has been rated as the best boys' school in the country. So the point that I think is I would like to make is that minority schools and colleges and educators have been at the forefront of building up something that is valuable. We don't need to wipe the slate clean. We don't need to totally, remove what is there as debris and then build again. If you do that, then you are really jeopardizing the whole of the country's future. Now, if you then acknowledge that Christian educational institutions and other minority institutions are at the forefront, have really produced some quality of education, then the first point I'd like to make is that there's not a single Christian educator involved in this whole exercise. Not on that commission, not on the drafting committee, other committees that were set up. No, there is no Christian educator there. And you will also agree that if there is no participation in the drafting, this translates as having no voice in the formation of the national education policy. And is that something that can be accepted? Okay, suppose there was no need, some would say, fine. Let us take the argument further on behalf of minority education. There is no mention of minority education rights at all in the document. Total eclipse. So what about Article 30 of the Constitution? Article 30, we all know, gives the right to minorities, religious and linguistic, the right to establish and to administer their institutions for the benefit of their communities and for the larger common good. That has been happening in a great deal of cases. Again, under the constitutional values, one of the speakers has also mentioned that, I think Professor Shyam Menon has said, they seem to have the whole dispensation that has created this document, they seem to have problems with the Constitution of India. Well, here is a proof of that. Under constitutional values, there's no mention of secularism at all, which is one of the pillars, the values, which is a pillar of what our country is being built on. We are all committed to that, and that's an important part of the structure of our constitution. And to not have that highlighted, not even mentioned, that I think is very surprising, and it is alarming also from the point of view of the minorities. And parallel to removing constitutional guarantees to minorities, we have the reservations for SCs and STs also not mentioned, therefore removed, because that is a very important structure that the country has built down the years. How is it that that has been totally removed? And therefore, my friends, is there envisaged a change in the basic character of the Constitution? Does the NEP envisage now changing the basic character of the Constitution? The Supreme Court has guaranteed that the basic character cannot be changed. But with the present Supreme Court membership, do you think there is a possibility of reversing this decision, of changing the basic character of the Constitution? Because the NEP is clearly indicating such an intention, with such important aspects of the Constitution not mentioned, totally glossed over. That would be the next step, because otherwise the NEP would be ultra-virus of the Constitution. And that is already a very major concern for any minority group, linguistic or religious. And I think the framers, in the way they are going to implement this, will have to take that into consideration, Otherwise, the jeopardy of the whole future generations of our countrymen and women will be at stake. So let me go further. That was my first major point. Next is, not content with going so far in its radical changes, the NEP, it has decided also to remove the present governing structure of minority schools by having no rule for the managing trustees. We are aware that minority schools and all private schools have a trust or a society running it, and there are trustees, there's the management there. Whereas here now in the NEP, this has not been mentioned at all. And any novice will be able to say that governance is crucial. Look at the state of most institutions in the country today. It's because of a lack of governance that we are having trouble. The minority institutions which are run by these trusts or societies with their own governing body members chosen by the management and have shown results, astounding results for so many decades, they have a controlling say at the moment over their institutions. Please realize that institutions with their infrastructure have been built up over decades with an excellent work culture among the staff, and the maintenance of both the physical and the human resources is a very important part of running an institution. Even when results have been acknowledged and even rewarded by previous governments and even by the present government, a decision has now been taken to take over the management of schools, including minority ones, in spite of Article 30, through a school complex management committee. Let me quote, the DSC, through its relevant official, for example, the BEO, will endorse and confirm the SCDP, which is the development plan, the school complex development plan of each complex, will endorse and confirm. In other words, the managements don't have a controlling say anymore. It will be all dictated by a government body. And we've heard what Professor Menon had to say about their government bodies and their work culture, their interests, etc. So an untested governance structure, or maybe we could say that a negatively portrayed governance structure with several people with no experience of managing education, these will destroy institutions that people have looked up to for years. Please remember that many of these institutions, minority run, are looked up to. They are, the type of admission pressure on them is tremendous. I've had the privilege of bearing that, and I still do. And so it is really surprising that all this management structure is going to be wiped clean. In higher education too, a board of governors shall be established consisting of a group of
Dr.
highly
Mascarenhas,
qualified... Yes.
3 minutes, please.
Yes. So a board of governors shall be established consisting of a group of highly qualified, competent and dedicated individuals having proven capabilities and a strong sense of commitment to the institution. Now, the constitution of this board of governors is not specified, but is clear there shall be overarching legislation that will supersede any contravening provisions of other earlier legislation. So in other words, my friends, you can see that there is really a total eclipse of all the good education that we have had. If you look at the school complexes, here also we are saying, they are saying, the document is saying that the resources of the good schools will now be made available to all the surrounding schools that don't have resources. Now, these schools have built up resources for their own students and staff. For example, take the staff. They have a teaching load. Their teaching load is fully is fully exhausted within the school. Now they'll have to go around to other schools to do the teaching. So in other words, my friends, let me conclude with this. I do think it is very worrying that this cleaning the slate, the demolishing all that there is and building up again is what seems to be on the anvil. And this will be to the detriment, not just of those who have been managing education, but it will be to the detriment of the entire country, the next generations of countries. Therefore, these are points that we need to take seriously and represent to the government in the way it is going to be implemented. Thank you very much. God bless.
Thank you, Father. We move on to the last speaker, Professor Vasavi. Madam.
Yes. Hello, everybody. All the previous speakers have highlighted several issues, and I'm very thankful to all of them. Like them, I'd like to just focus on the issue that I was asked to talk about, which is the significance of the national education policy for rural regions and communities. Coming to that, one needs to look at the extent to which this document is really a very layered document. It has a few, I would say, very few positive aspects, but largely, as the other speakers have highlighted, draws on its own agenda and therefore overlooks many of the issues that India really needs to face. In its terms of its positive contributions or taking on some progressive ideas, I would just like to flag the fact that it pays attention to early childhood care and education, which is for children from 3 to 6, which is very important. It also recognizes the importance of providing nutrition, especially for disadvantaged children. It suggests in one paragraph the provisioning of even breakfast in addition to the midday meal scheme. This again is very important given the fact that we have a large proportion of our population which is food insecure, and especially now in the current conditions, and which I think the pandemic related distress, we are going to see much more of this over the coming year. An emphasis on the home language or mother tongue learning, which I think is again important up till standard 5, which in some ways may indirectly be a corrective to the wave of English medium education or to the demand for English medium education and the resulting dissonance that we see that has been created across the country. Finally, I think it also pays considerable attention to teacher training and especially to the professionalization of teacher education, which is very important. But apart from this, the report primarily draws on celebrating India's classical heritage of languages and knowledge, but it overlooks the complexity of contemporary conditions, especially of rural India. And over the past decades, much of rural India has been subject to processes of, as many of you know, of economic deceleration, of tremendous displacement of populations, and also forms of distress, not only about in the form of suicides, but also through distress migration of populations to urban areas and to other various work sites. So within this background, some of the key issues that one can focus related primarily to rural societies and to rural regions would be the extent to which this document claims to quote unquote bridge the gaps in access, participation, and learning outcomes for all citizens. But it overlooks the fact that poor quality education, especially in rural India, marks and mars the lives of many citizens. For example, it fails to address the fact that we have a very differentiated education system in the country. It's differentiated primarily on the class basis, giving the most poor quality, the cheapest education to the most disadvantaged, which would be the Adivasis, and providing and making it possible for the rich or of the elite to have exclusive and international kinds of education. So there is the spectrum of schools to which citizens have access to, and it also means that large numbers get only poor quality education. So this report in no way addresses some of these structural deficits in the education system itself. The school also sort of overlooks the fact that it is the growing privatization of schools, which Geeta Nambisan highlighted very well, also feeds into the fact that there is a fragmentation of the educational experience in rural India. For example, in a village, it is quite possible that the children of a village go to something like 5 to 6 different types of schools, and therefore they really don't come together as a community. There is no forging of a common shared experience or a sense of citizenship or a sense of social belonging to the area. And this is what we're seeing right across the country. Providing, again, only on the basis of enhancing access to education, but providing poor quality education has also meant that many students now are not able to access professional education and therefore quality jobs. For example, good data shows that right up till the 1970s or so, it was possible for rural students or students from rural areas to get into professional education, for example, medicine, engineering, other kinds of higher education like research and science, etc. But since the past 2 decades, much of this has been blocked, and you see very few rural students who can access some of these higher professional streams. Along with this, what we see is the extent to which at the higher education level, there is an adverse integration of rural youth into some of these higher educational institutions. This report calls for the establishment of large multiple universities and colleges, but it also emphasizes distant and what is called online and distant learning, as if to say that is a panacea to resolve all the problems of accessibility. In fact, what it overlooks is the fact that mass higher education of very poor quality has caused tremendous problems in the society and in the nation. What we see today across the country are a large population of disaffected youth who are alienated from their rural, agrarian, or their communities, who are unemployable. It's not just they don't get unemployed, but the skills that they have, whatever they are supposed to have learned in these colleges, are of such poor quality that they really don't get jobs. So you have a large restive population, which also then becomes amenable to all kinds of mobilization and therefore to all forms of violence, which we're again recording across the countries. This is also one of the key facts, and again, it's not registered very well, is that some of the highest rates of suicide now, which is being documented, is by educated but unemployed youth, which is directly linked to the kind of distress that poor quality mass education is creating in the country. As a result of much of this poor quality education, we also see the extent to which the report does not cater to either addressing this, to enhancing access, but makes very simplistic and broad-based suggestions such as the need to integrate Lok Vidya or people's knowledge, which it identifies as yoga, Ayush, Sanskrit, etc., with a combination of high technologies, for example, artificial intelligence, digital learning, machine learning, etc., all of which are, of course, focused on the global market or in the global technology-led economies. Such prescriptions overlook the need for establishing smaller, focused, community-based, region-based colleges which can be accessed by youth, or the ways in which new knowledge systems, new skills can be disseminated to youth, and which can also have great significance not only for regional economies, but for the nation as a whole. For example, given the extent to which there are large amounts of debates on the need for new disciplinary practices and disciplinary orientations, none of these are considered in the report. It overlooks the need for example, new kinds of ecological sciences or ecological skills, for example, conservation of water or forests or soils, which is very important, agroecologies that need to be revitalized in all the regions, reviving and professionalizing the healthcare systems through integrating in indigenous health knowledge, medical knowledge, which is very sophisticated, alternative architecture, vernacular architecture, which would again address not only climate change issues, but also the excessive concretization that we are seeing across the country, or the range of very sophisticated skills that are embodied or repositories in craftsmen, a range of artisans, again in various regions. So instead of combining all this to form a pool of skilled, talented youth who can not only cater to local, regional needs, but who can also lead fulfilling lives and have holistic employment and livelihoods, the report just makes very broad-based generalizations about the need to provide higher education for a larger proportion of people. It also makes suggestions for special education zones, and again, earlier speakers have highlighted this, described very briefly. We don't know, it just says special education zones to be set up in disadvantaged areas and in aspirational districts, and there are no descriptions or definitions as to what are these aspirational districts. So one needs to question whether these special education zones would mimic something like the quota educational institutions, where much of quota has now become a center for preparing youth for cracking entrance exams to professional education, medicines, engineering, etc. And we know, for example, all the recent studies have shown the tremendous stress that they put on the youth who go there and the kind of distortions and disorientations they create. Or would special education zones be like the one called Challakere, which is only 120 kilometers from Bangalore, but in where the new undergraduate center for the Indian Institute of Science is being set up, which was created, by allocating 10,000 acres of land from primarily pastoral people to setting up both a science city and for advanced studies center and for new kinds of educational institutions, which led not only to the displacement of people and to their dispossessions, but actually in many ways challenges the very idea of citizenship and also right to information in these areas. About the socioeconomically disadvantaged group, other speakers have also highlighted, and I think the report not only fails to define these groups or to cater to their specific needs, but it also very deliberately does not engage with issues such as the reservation policies, even if the reservation policy must be critiqued and alternatives to be provided. None of this does the report take a stand. In fact, it makes a very cautious oversight of all this, of these issues. Finally, I also want to say that although the report claims and asserts that education in its very first statement, it says its purpose, what it sees as the purpose of education is to achieve full human potential, develop an equitable and just society, and promote national development. What it does in reality is fails to address various vexatious issues, troubling issues, which we've seen recurring across the country, and which may challenges not only the idea of education as a public good, but also in many ways may enhance an already hierarchical society. As Professor Mascarenhas put it very well, this report is not only against the Constitution and the spirit of the Constitution, but in many ways it seems to endorse a society in which hierarchy itself seems to be embedded. So overall, just looking at the report, shifting from what was in its form, in its draft form, it was about 400 and odd pages. The current one, which has been put into the parliament and now endorsed, is only 66 pages. It's very succinct. But in its succinct, in its summative form, and I think it overlooks what I would call 4 very important Ds, which is democracy, diversity, decentralization, and the sense of decency. Democracy has the other speakers have highlighted, we know that the report did not consult representatives from various groups. It's not only religious minorities, but also people from various schools of thought. I know for a fact that many people petitioned the commission when it was working with Secretariat was in Bangalore. Many people petitioned them to be asked to be invited to make presentations, but they were not allowed in. Although in the draft report, it acknowledges close to 1,000 people, we know that these 1,000 people were made very selectively. So it is the exclusion of very important voices and of representatives that makes this report not a democratic one. And as Father Mascarenhas highlighted so well, the issues of minority educational institutions is not highlighted or engaged with at all. In fact, it assumes that a blanket kind of a standardized kind of educational system would be put across the country, which again, as one of the speakers highlighted, it shifts away from the focus from a concurrent list to that of a central list. Secondly, in terms of diversity, it does not, again, not only about religious minorities and institutions, it flags very briefly the space that it will give to alternative education, but there are no descriptions to the alternatives that could be made possible. For example, alternatives that could focus much more on smaller communities and on more kinds of new forms of knowledge, and also an integration between the lower levels up to the higher levels, or to the diversity of educational practices that could be possible. So, thirdly, I think the issue of decentralization is also overlooked, as the earlier speakers have highlighted. The report suggests a very hierarchical and centralized structure, uh, with primarily the political representatives as being key to it. It fails to give scope to not only state level conditions, but it also fails to make it possible for educational institutions to be run as democratic institutions. In a context where we see education has not only the biggest source of leveler, but education and democracy has been closely linked, that they have an umbilical cord, that only when you have an educational system that promotes democracy can we have a viable democracy. And I think this report in many ways not only erases that, but it challenges many of the ideas that could be associated with education being for democracy. Finally, I think the idea of decency, the need for us to look at decency, by which I describe as in a context in where all institutions do not humiliate people. And I think this report does not look at that. The premise, one of the key premises of education, which is equality of educational opportunity itself, is overlooked, although it's sort of makes broad-based prescriptions about making access easy. In failing to look at the specificities in which this will be engendered, it really denies this equality of educational opportunity. And again, as earlier speakers spoke or highlighted, it is an increasing linkage to a global technology-led economy and to a cultural kind of approach to education that seems to mark much of this report. So overall, as with in assessing many of the other recent policies that have come into being, that are being formulated at the center, I am not surprised that the rural in this context is seen as redundant. It is something in which much of rural agrarian agricultural India should move towards becoming urban and becoming industrialized and hooked to a larger economy. It fails to treat rural citizens as not only residents, as not only as equal citizens endowed with all rights, but it continues to see rural people as burdensome subjects, as people who must be just given some occasional sops. So overall, my assessment is that in the context of looking at the NEP and its linkage to rural areas, we see it privileging, again, not only an urban industrial perspective, but it fails to look at the possibilities of the ways in which true citizenship can be endowed, and in which dichotomies or divides such as rural versus urban, agricultural versus industrial, all the other kinds of divides that the country is witnessing, for example, the caste-based or religion-based divides. Many of these contentious and vexatious issues are not being addressed at all. So with this, I'd just like to conclude my small presentation, and I'd like to thank all the organizers for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, madam.
Yeah. Thank you, the eminent panelists. And I think the panelists have brought out a lot of issues for our discussion. Thank you, Professor Valerian Rodriguez, for bringing out succinctly the framework of the NEP in its 4 domains. The questions on the social capital for carrying out the social design definitely needs immediate attention. Professor Shyam Menon has brought out in the issue of federalism and the discourse of the middle class, the need for consensus. brought the issues of private-public partnership and as the need to consider policy in the process, taking cognizance of its social impact and the social context. Father Fraser has brought in the issues of minorities and the commendable service that the minorities has done to the state. Father has brought into the attention the total eclipse of the minority rights and the reference to Article 30, the positive discrimination that is definitely part of our Indian Constitution, where we speak of the STs and SCs. And we have Madam Vasavi, which has brought out beautifully the layered document of this NEP and these positive aspects of it in terms of early education, nutrition, teacher training, and has drawn our attention to the rural poor, the poor qualities of education, and the structural deficit which this NEP should have addressed. But I think some more issues she has brought in are very important, considering the rural people as a burden and the need for the shared interest, being forged into the communities. Thank you, the panelists. These are voices of the people I consider through these panelists. And these are the people who are working closely with the society. I'm happy we could have all these panelists in this colloquium.
Professor Rose, I don't think we can hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Would somebody else from St. Aloysius take over?
We can't hear.
Professor Rose, we
Yes,
could not
yes,
hear you.
yes. There was a little, there was a little technical glitch. We are coming back to you. Now we have Dr. Joyce helping us to take over the question and answer session.
I apologize for the technical problems that we are facing at the moment. I will be asking about 2 questions minimum to our panelists. They make a note of these questions, and when I call upon each panelist, they address the audience by answering them. The first 2 questions are for Professor Valerian. Why it's being told that the National Education 2020 policy is inspired by the RSS? I did not get this point. Second question to Professor Valerian. Is this policy prominently focused on language transition? I repeat the question, sir. Why is it being told that the NEP 2020 is inspired by the RSS? Second question, is this policy prominently focused on language transition? Question 2 Professor Shyam Menon, please elaborate on the advantages of restructuring the already existing structure from 5 to 18 years. I repeat, please elaborate on the advantages of restructuring the already existing structure from 5 to 18 years. Second question to Professor Menon, is there any thought of overhauling the testing, evaluation, and grading that favors meritocracy, which has been a middle class obsession? I repeat, is there any thought of overhauling the testing, evaluation, and grading that favors meritocracy, which has been a middle class obsession? Question to Professor Geeta Nambisan. With diverse culture and interstate differences, how far NEP 2020 can be successfully implemented? I repeat, with diverse culture and interstate differences, how far NEP 2020 can be successfully implemented? Question to Father Fraser Mascarenhas. In what footsteps does this policy follow the neoliberal one that was set in place over 2 decades ago and strengthened in the past 5 years The whole document poses a strong challenge to the constitutional ideas where secularism the whole document poses a strong challenge to the core constitutional ideas. So in this context, where does secularism stand in the face of NEP? The second question is how to impose 3-language formula in the present NEP 2020. Second question to Father Fraser Mascarenhas, how to impose 3-language formula in the present NEP 2020. Question to Professor Vasavi. Don't you think the mother tongue system puts Dalits and first generation English speakers at a greater disadvantage? The policy has ignored the marginalized communities. Repeat, don't you think the mother tongue system puts Dalits and first generation English speakers at a greater disadvantage? The policy totally ignores the marginalized communities. The first question will be answered. First 2 questions will be answered by Professor Valerian. Each panelist gets a minimum of 2 minutes. Over to Professor Valerian.
Thank you, Joyce, for these reworded questions. 2 minutes is far too short a time to respond to these large queries. The first question, why do you say that this document could be said to be RSS inspired? Or can we say that this document is RSS inspired? I didn't say that. I said that initially there were apprehensions that there would be much of RSS thinking as far as this document is concerned. And I mentioned that it did not overtly seem to be so. And I used that term overtly very deliberately. Now, why did I say that there were apprehensions? Because Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh has displayed keen interest with regard to educational curriculum for a very long time, and it runs a large array of educational institutions across the country and is very keen in terms of incubating the youth of the future. However, I feel that the RSS ideology is very strongly visible in this document in several domains. It centers the idea of the nation with regard to education. It has very little, there are very few references to the idea of democracy as such, which several speakers have pointed out. And it brings in a very poor consideration with regard to the constitutional structure of India. With regard to the second question, and I'm just taking half a minute, I appreciate this document for the kind of emphasis it lays on learning languages. And I think in a country like India, it is important that we emphasize on learning languages. And the document very strongly draws our attention to this particular concern, because languages are very strongly connected to democracy and to the strengthening of egalitarian tendencies in India. However, language learning, the way it is pointed out in this document, could be very strongly technical rather than connected to the larger popular cultures. Thank you. Thank you.
And now, can I respond to the questions that have been addressed to me? Although both these questions are not based on the presentations I made, but all the same, I think they are important questions. About the restructuring, I would only have to say the following. I think it's all very well to for a national policy to actually promulgate or announce a structure. It's quite another to actually implement it. If you look at the 1968 NPE, you'll find that the 10+2+3 actually was implemented in the state of Uttar Pradesh after 30 years. So it took about 3 decades for them to actually implement it. So it's all very well for structures to be suggested, but these are structures also representing organizational arrangements. And for there is a certain inertia that is there in the manner in which institutions are organized, and to change that is actually very not easy. But there are some advantages in this particular which they have organized, and one of the speakers mentioned that's the early childhood care and education has now been given some focus, but that's again a truism. It doesn't have any tooth or nail in that particular provision in the in the policy, because there is no mention of amending the right to education in the light of that. Unless there is a right to education element in it, I think a child who hasn't really gone through the early childhood care and education at the age of 6 actually comes to for admission in the primary school, she can't be denied, because the existing rule says that it's a right, child's right to pursue education between the age of 6 and 14. So right to education has to be included in this. Problem is that this particular document does not recognize education as a right. It is averse to admitting anything like a right. That is the major problem. So no matter what kind of changes that you make. This other question about testing and evaluation and grading, I mean, this whole thing about meritocracy, the whole what is the middle class conception of it, and the entire school system revolving around the 12th standard examination and the entrance examination to the higher education, particularly IITs and so on. That entire system is problematic, and the policy doesn't say anything about it. It talks about the 10th grade, the board exam to be removed, etc., but which has been even administratively done earlier. And we have gone back on it, and then it was made optional and so on and so forth. But that's a bit of a superficial, rudimentary one. But the major examination-oriented, coaching industry-oriented, final testing, final 12th standard as a critical point, all these things are not really looked at. And the divorce that exists between the teaching and evaluation at the moment, because evaluation determines teaching now. What is tested is being taught. What is tested is being learned. There is no change in that in the present system.
Okay, to take up the 2 questions that were posed to me. One is the challenge to secularism. Yes, that I think is what I try to highlight. that the word secularism and therefore the constitutional provision of secularism as a pillar of our democracy, that seems to be have been totally eclipsed in this document. And so, although they have not said anything about doing away with secularism, but implicitly that's the consequence that we are going to face. The second question was imposing the three-language formula. I think one of our speakers has mentioned India is so diverse, we cannot really have a formula that will work for all. And so there needed to be options. For example, in Maharashtra, we have a 4-language formula. We have, of course, the medium of instruction, then we have Hindi, Marathi, and we have a foreign language too. And there are choices for our students. So there is need for, not that a uniformity that this document seems to be trying to push down on the states. Thank you.
Shall I just come in?
Professor Geeta.
Yeah, actually, I got only one of your questions, but I saw the second one on the board. Regarding diversity, I think that one of the issues has been that the policy has not addressed cultural diversity. A child has the right to his or her culture, and the school has to acknowledge the culture of the child. In fact, early learning must be located within that culture. If you go to the National Curriculum Framework, I think that is highlighted there. Interstate differences, I mean, a lot depends. There are many, state level, many concerns. I think one has to go there. But as I think Professor Shamenan or one of them has said, this greater centralization and the fact that the states are asked to bring in their finances, I think that will be a problem where the states are concerned. And I think more recently, the World Bank has come in to try and improve many of the states which are doing pretty well. So I think we need to look at that again. The second thing, I just saw it in that box where someone has asked whether the greater privatization is an excuse for the failure of the public. I think it's time we have to go back to what is the success of the private, where really the poor and disadvantaged are concerned. There is no evidence on that. And what is the failure of the public? I mean, which public is actually failing? There are many publicly funded schools which are doing pretty well. So I think we need to, and we have yet to see data that shows schools that cater to the poor, private schools, are highly successful. So I think we need to go back and look at what are the kinds of complexities around these issues. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for answering the second question too. Apologies for not asking it. There is a second question for Professor Vasavi. Can someone elaborate the benefits of decentralized government? This I would request Professor Vasavi to answer. Can you elaborate the benefits of decentralized government along with the first question that was asked to you? Professor Vasavi? Professor Vasavi, can you hear? Kindly unmute yourself, madam.
Says the host cannot do it.
No, now you're audible, ma'am. You're audible.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so the question was about mother tongue, medium of instruction, and linked to Dalits and marginalization. I just want to say that there's been a lot of misinformation about this issue. In fact, this misinformation makes it seem like the road to success is primarily through English education, and that good learning only takes place through the English medium, etc. But in fact, a lot of studies have shown the importance of learning in the mother tongue for both cognitive development and later has the foundation for all kinds of learning abilities. And many people don't seem to recognize the importance of this. Secondly, the fact is that disadvantaged communities has, I think again, Geeta has elaborated on that, send their children to poor quality, low fee paying private schools in which English is taught as the medium of instruction, but it is very poorly taught. As a result of this, over the past 2 decades, what we are seeing now are several youth who are not competent in any language. They cannot write or read their own mother tongue languages, nor are they competent in English. So it is the dual incompetencies that we are seeing across a whole generation of youth. So I think there is need to recognize these problems and to say, and as the report, in fact, I think that is one of the positive features of the report. It talks about mother tongue learning up till 5th standard, and all studies have shown that after the 5th or 6th, after elementary education, it is possible to add on another language, in this case which could be English or any other language. So I think it is the adding on and integrating the different languages into our education system that is important, rather than seeing only English as hegemonic or as important. Thank you.
There is a general question, since we have another 10 minutes. This is a general question for all the panelists. What kind of amendments do you suggest for NEP 2020 to make our educational system inclusive, equitable, accountable, corruption-free, and human value-based? Professor Valerian?
It's a hold all kind of a question. What is the kind of alternative does one suggest from the ground of being a critique? Let me put it in some adjectives. I would think about, I personally think there is a very big need to revisit the entire educational curriculum in India. There are some good schools, there are some schools which are doing very well, but it is important that the entire educational curriculum be re-looked and critically evaluated. This is the first one I would suggest. The second one is, I think we need to think about educational system in terms of the history and social structure and the kind of economy that we confront and the kind of democracy that we have chosen in terms of the future. Now, for me, all these four issues are quite important. That ours is a very deeply diverse country. It is not merely a simple diversity of languages and backgrounds. It's also people adhering to very different visions of life, very different kind of dreams about their life, very different kind of belief systems in their life. So we need to take into account the deep diversities in which our lives are caught. We need to think that India is a democracy. As several people have pointed out, democracy is not a serious consideration in this report at all. And if there is one thing to be exalted in India, it is the idea of democracy. And in fact, Professor Vasavi has even pointed out that the commission was not even prepared to listen to alternative voices. And this is scandalous, that a commission which actually begins to think about overhauling the entire country. And of course, in this country, the education policy needs to address the demos. And the demos in India is a demos which is largely deprived, exploited, and even oppressed demos. Yeah. Yes.
Any other panelist who would like to contribute?
If I may address this briefly.
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, I think just like Professor Valerian mentioned about diversity, I think what one word that is even not mentioned once is equality. It's equality. In the sense, we have to start with with conceding that India is the most unequal society. We are incredible in our inequality. So I think, and education was always considered as an instrument towards to combat this inequality. But this particular policy has deliberately jettisoned equality, just like it has jettisoned democracy. It has also jettisoned equality. from its entire discourse. Partly also to make us acquainted with a new discourse, which does not have to always talk about democracy, secularism, and equality. So I always feel that this particular policy is not just about education. It is actually a larger political pedagogy that this present dispensation is giving to the citizens of this country, that get used to a new discourse where there won't be any democracy, there won't be any equality, there won't be secularism, there won't be any talk about minorities, and so on. So that is the issue. So if at all, it's not a question of just rudimentary amendment in the constitution and in the policy here and there. Actually, it has to be reconceptualized, and while doing so, it has to be done with a certain modesty, that the bulk of the operation of education is done by the states. So without consulting them, without getting them on board, I think that it has no meaning. This particular exercise has no meaning.
Any other panelist who would like to answer?
Yeah, just for a minute. No, I also agree with both of them, Professor Shamanan and with Valerian, that it has to be very clearly located in constitutional values, whether it's equality, social justice, etc. And we have a constitutional right to education, so equitable education, and I think that's important. I also believe that discourses are to be carefully looked at. There's constantly construction of what is good education, private education is good. I think one has to go behind this and have a look at what is it that we are now, what are the new mindsets that are being built? What is the new common sense that is being built? And I think we have to really look again at the considerable privatization that is happening, often by stealth and often very quietly. And we have to equip ourselves as researchers to really look at this so that we know what's going on. Yeah, and that's, I think it cannot just be tampering with a little here and there. Yeah.
Well, I agree with what has been said by the previous three speakers. I would just add this. I think, what is crucial in education at the moment is to build up public infrastructure for education, especially in rural areas and for disadvantaged groups, and to build up a work culture, an educational culture. Because I've seen when I've worked in the slums in non-formal education, schools having the infrastructure. At sometimes in our non-formal classes, they would allow us to use the infrastructure, including internet and smart boards, etc., although the school didn't use it. And in other places, they would not use it themselves, nor allow us to use it. So you see that whole educational culture needs to be built up. And I would have been really happy if the new education policy had tackled that rather than making a whole sweeping change in the structures of education, which I think really are counterproductive.
Professor Vasavi, to the question that was asked earlier on elaborate the benefits of decentralized government, there was a question which I skipped, and that is, what is your take on the question of out-of-school children that is mentioned in NEP 2020 under the chapter curtailing dropouts? What is your take on the question of out-of-school children in NEP 2020 under the chapter curtailing dropout? Kindly unmute yourself, ma'am.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. About the dropout children, I think it's a major issue, but I again have a problem with the idea of just mainstreaming them into the regular schools, because many children tend to be overage, for example, if they've dropped out at standard 2, by the time they're re-enrolled, they would be, much older and they can't stand standard 2. So some kind of alternative learning spaces have to be created for such children. But again, the learning methodologies, the curriculum, all of that would have to be very different. And all of this would require to be very decentralized, very region-specific, site-specific, etc. And that is why, and I think one of the questions was about decentralization. This is why we need decentralization in education in a very significant way, rather than what the report is not only suggesting, but also trying to emphasize, which is a very much a centralized model. So I would say that the issue of out-of-school children, there are large numbers, much more than what formal data is indicating, much more than, you know, the close to only the 40 to 50 million, which is indicating now. And I think along with this, mostly it's out of school, we consider only mostly children below 14 or 16. But I think dropout youth, looking at youth who have dropped out in the so-called mass higher education institutions, much more attention needs to be given to those youth, because I think they are in need of both emotional scaffolding and in reskilling and in directing them towards larger, you know, social orientation.
Thank you, ma'am. As we come to an end, I would like to thank our principal, Reverend Dr. Praveen Martis SJ, for his message and for taking leadership in facilitating this colloquium. We are grateful to the coordinator of Paramash scheme, UGC Paramash scheme, Dr. Jayaprakash, for enabling the colloquium. A person who gives a critique is many a times misunderstood as a critic. However, this slice any subject matter that interests an audience to show the deep meaning, no matter what taste it leaves the audience with, without succumbing to fear or favor. Our heartfelt thank you to all our eminent panelists, Dr. Valerian Rodriguez, Professor Shyam Menon, Professor Geeta Nambisan, Dr. Fraser Mascarenhas SJ, and Professor R. Vasavi. Your readiness to be the panelists and the nuanced critique that you individually offered on NEP 2020 will be remembered with gratitude. Thank you all. We thank Dr. Ronald Nazareth, Department of Chemistry, for enabling the Zoom platform, and Mr. Royal D'Souza and Mr. Satish Nayak, Department of Computer Applications, for enabling the YouTube platforms and giving us the much necessary technical support. The Political Science Department has facilitated the entire colloquium. Special thanks to Dr. Rosevira D'Souza for conducting the colloquium as convener, Mr. Alvin D'Souza for coordinating this activity, Mrs. Maria Shaila D'Souza, Ms. Divya. The entire colloquium arrangements were taken care of by Mr. Godwin DeMello, the maintenance officer, and his team members, including Mr. Anil Lobo and Ms. Divya Shetty for her melodious rendition. Thank you to all the participants. You have been a wonderful participants. I wish all of you a very good evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.
There's a feedback that the participants have to fill. Kindly fill in the feedback and your certificates will be e-generated.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless.
Audio.